Welcome back to a brand new episode of the MMA Beat. It is Thursday, April 19th, 2018. Hi again, everyone. I'm Ariel Helwani, back inside our New York City studio. Thank you very much for joining us. We're going three deep once again this week. And no, your eyes are not deceiving you. That is, in fact, Luke Thomas. I do believe for the first time in 2018, he is joining us in studio.
No.
I think this is true.
It's been a while.
It has been a while.
I am back. People ask me, are you still on the show? I'm still on the show. But I had some stuff to take care of at home. So,
welcome back.
All right, yes.
Good to have you. And of course, he is from SiriusXM and MMAfighting.com. That is a man who needs no introduction, the man in the shirt, Jeff Wagenheim of ESPN, old reliable himself. Thank you very much for being here, guys. Okay, we have much to discuss as always. Never a dull moment in MMA, but I want to throw a curveball your way. I don't think you were expecting me to ask you this right off the top. Here's the big question of the week. Did you watch the premiere of The Ultimate Fighter last night?
I did not. I did DVR it.
Okay. Are you planning on watching it?
No. No. I mean, I'm not opposed to
You DVR'd out of habit?
So I DVR'd on, not to get into the details, but too much, but I DVR'd on YouTube TV, which has unlimited DVR.
I didn't know that.
So I'll just DVR anything, and that way it's archived if I need to go back and get it for whatever reason.
Does it, by the way, does it save it on your computer or on your TV?
In the cloud.
Oh, interesting.
In the cloud. So you can just as much as you want. So I did DVR it, and I'm not opposed to going back to it. Look, I know yesterday was the 27th season, and I was talking about this with some friends yesterday. It's very easy every time the Ultimate Fighter comes out to say bad things about it, which you can. But I have a lot of nice things to say about the Ultimate Fighter. I really do. I think it's been incredibly important as a window into the mixed martial arts world for the average person. It's been valuable in helping to launch the brand. It's been valuable in keeping the brand on TV. But you know, we do this song and dance every season. It's just so totally, we are numb to it at this point because it is so overdone. So no, I have not watched it.
Jeff?
I did not watch it, although I also have it saved to perhaps watch the. Yeah, well, I have a VHS tape that I'm carrying around.
VCR cloud.
Yeah, exactly.
You mean Betamax?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. If I watch anything, I will watch the fights, and I kind of, you know, if I see a little bit of a buzz online where people say, "Oh man, just catch that fight last night," then I may go back and watch it. I'm not, you know, really that interested in any season. I'm not interested in all the other parts of it, right. Particularly this season. I mean, there's not really going to be. I don't expect there to be a lot of drama because the two guys who are coaching are respectful of each other, and even though I support that, I don't necessarily need to see that interaction. They also have acknowledged that Stipe has acknowledged that he's not really a coach, that he has brought coaches in there, so I'm not going to get much of a window into him as a coach, although, you know, Daniel Cormier, as we know, is a coach, is now a high school wrestling coach, and so maybe there will be some interesting things from his coaching. So maybe I'll watch a little bit of that, but mostly I'll watch the fights. These are all undefeated fighters, and so they had to beat somebody, and you know, we'll see whether they're guys that I want to follow through the season.
Miocic Cormier is one of the best fights the UFC currently has scheduled, and it's on that very important sort of 4th of July show for them, July 7th to be exact. Is there any way that them being a part of this show waters down that fight, if you get what I'm saying? Or because you don't watch it, it's sort of, you know, a tree falling in the forest and it doesn't really affect it. Is there a chance that them being on that show for 13 straight weeks and, you know, you gotta miss someone, right? That's the whole thing with I think combat sports like that. Brock has always been very good at that. Like he goes away and then he comes back and you kind of miss him. Excuse me. Is it possible that this ends up being a mistake, or because the show has kind of fallen on hard times, it doesn't really matter at this point?
That's a good question, you know, but I guess I'm torn a little bit. In the end, I probably don't think it would hurt it, if at all. I don't think it would hurt it too much, if at all. I don't know how much, and it does help it too. It's complicated because I spoke to Cormier on Tuesday or what? Today's Thursday, right? So maybe yesterday or the day before. And he was exhausted from doing media. He was on the Rich Eisen show. He had spoken to other reporters in the space. And I asked him what it was like interacting with Stipe, and his answer was, fine, we don't have a rivalry this season. I'm just going to go ahead and tell you that. There's not a whole lot to it. And
it's actually feeling like it's a selling point. the no rivalry.
I don't think it's a selling point.
No, they're trying to make it into a selling point.
Yeah. They're
I've
trying
seen
to tell
the UFC
you
tweet this.
It's about these guys. Yeah. I mean, then why have coaches if it's about these guys?
True.
So in that sense, it's not going to do themselves any favor. In the end, though, you are still on TV. There is still this exposure to the brand, however much limited it is relative to its past. So it'll probably. I don't think in any way this show is going to boost the sales into the stratosphere. I don't know that it would take them down from their baseline either.
Okay.
Yeah, there are definitely, we've seen in mixed martial arts and really combat sports in general that when people have a beef with each other, there's a segment of the population that really gets more excited to see that. Now, that's not really me. I'm all for seeing athletes who are great athletes and nothing more, who are not interested in having a beef with their opponent. And I'm interested in seeing these two guys because you've got the best heavyweight probably ever, and you've got the reigning champion at light heavyweight. You got two champions going against each other. That's enough for me. That should be enough for any serious fans of the sport. Mm-hmm. There are some people who need to have that, that friction, that, Cormier Jones or, some other kind of friction. I don't feel like that's not really important. It's, so I guess to answer your question, I don't think it necessarily helps, although there may be some people who will watch this and see one of these guys or both these guys being respectful, sort of good citizens, and say, I want to root for that guy. I want to watch that guy compete. Probably not as many as there would have been if these guys were, butting heads the whole time.
I'll say this. I don't know that the show in and of itself will do a whole lot, but to promote this show, Stipe did a media tour. As I mentioned, DC did a media tour, including hitting Rich Eisen as well. I do think because those guys are a part of this, it might give them more media opportunities. And then through that kind of exposure, and again, not just the ones they did, but on down the line, that might help sales or awareness or buzz. But the show itself, like as an anchor, I mean, the UFC still wants us, I guess through contract they have to, but it feels like they want us to look at the Ultimate Fighter as this pillar of MMA fandom. So, for example, if you're an NFL fan, what is it next week? It's the Combine, right? Yeah. That's a pillar of...
you mean the draft.
Sorry, the draft. What am I saying? Combine was already... The draft is next week. Man, the draft is a big deal. Yeah. No matter what team you're on, you want to know who you're going to get. And so that's a real pillar of that experience. Tough isn't anymore, and that's okay. That's not to degrade it, only to measure it what it is. So I just think the media exposure is probably fine, but the show itself...
Here's what I've come to realize with Tough, and this may sound weird, but I actually don't think that Tough is for us. And I don't even know if it's for the audience who watches this show, because I meet a lot of people, at my kids', birthday parties and things like that, dads who say like, oh, did you watch that show on FS1 with the tournament? People still talk to me about it. I mean, I even had Jonas Jerebko of the Utah Jazz say that he still watches it. Like, there is a sector of, I think, MMA fans. You think he's lying? Why? No, but I meet a lot of dads who don't watch the fight nights on Saturday, who don't pay for the pay-per-views, who think that it's pretty cool that every Wednesday there's guys living in a house and then they end up fighting. Yeah. And I do believe that in a weird way, and I'm curious to see what the ratings are, and they usually start, at their highest and then kind of trickle down. But I almost, in a weird way, believe that Cormier and Stipe being on the show together, they kind of, like, the fact that they're champions and they're the stars that they are, there's a rub there, as opposed to if you're putting, with all due respect, like Eddie Alvarez and Justin Gaethje aren't champions in the UFC. They aren't arguably the greatest heavyweight of all. So I actually feel like this is the first time in a very long time, maybe the Ronda Rousey season, where the coaches actually, give the show a bit of a rub. I don't know what that will translate into, but maybe for the casual audience, it translates into something if you're told these two guys are coaches in the best of all time in their respective weight classes, arguably.
I would frame it the same way as you did, as opposed to, relating it to the NFL draft. I think that there's it's a little different. I mean, you're a big fan of your team. I'm a big fan of my team. Where we expect that draft to bring us some kind of some usable part, some athlete who's going to come in and make a difference for us. I don't know that a diehard MMA fan is looking at Tough and saying, ooh, I can't wait to see the guy that's going to come in and is going to be the big difference maker in the sport. But I do think it's more of an entry point for people who are dipping their toe into the sport and deciding that whether this is something that's interesting because of all the drama around it. It makes it a little bit more palatable for an audience that doesn't want to just sit there and watch fighting.
That being said, I think it has 100% run its course. Yeah. And I think that once this new TV deal kicks in with whichever network or networks, I think it would be wise to move on from it. And to me, I feel like managers and fighters have smartened up and have realized that, okay, perfect scenario, you debut in the UFC. Next best scenario, you go through the Contender Series. Third place is tough. I don't think people are viewing tough as, okay, let me just get in through the side door here. I think most people would rather go through the Contender Series. And I think that at this point, give credit to the UFC, they've set up the replacement for tough.
Totally.
It's right there.
It's a wonderful series.
The Contender Series should replace tough.
Right.
And it should probably be on a bigger platform than Fight Pass whenever this new TV deal kicks in, whatever that platform is. But I feel like if I'm a fighter trying to make, my way into the UFC, get my foot in the door, so to speak, the Contender Series is the way to go, right? Why go through the house and all that nonsense?
Yeah, the Contender Series, if you can win the Ultimate Fighter, there's probably a benefit to that because there's still a little bit of exposure.
Think about what you have to do to get there.
So long, right?
Yeah.
There's just a lot less signal to noise ratio with the Contender Series. It is something like the UFC's draft in a way, at least over the course of the season. The thing about the ratings that's interesting to me, and you said, oh, people come up to you and say they watch it. I occasionally experience an MMA fan who does. I don't know personally anybody who watches it, but here's what I would say. The UFC is actually pretty good about doing their own internal surveys and metrics and finding what audiences like. Yes, they contractually have to keep the Ultimate Fighter on, but also there is clearly an audience for it, however related to MMA is this. Yeah. But the point being is relative to the highs of Ultimate Fighter 14, where you're averaging 2.5, 3 million viewers, and now you're literally at 10% of that, literally 10% of that. Yes, there is an audience still, and that's a valuable one, but there's just simply mathematically, there's no denying there's an extraordinary decline in its value and purpose. So that's it.
My sentiment also is that they're trying to beef up the Contender Series. I think that you're going to see bigger names, not just, local guys. Like Valentina Shevchenko's sister has been signed, and I'm hearing that they're talking to other more recognizable names where they're basically saying, like, look, we'll kind of give you the same amount of money to debut, but we want to beef up this show, and this is a good platform for you because now you're one of Dana White's, choices, and, look at some of the guys that have, look at Sean O'Malley, what he's been able to do, and it feels to me like Dana as a promoter, because his name is attached to the show, and let's not kid ourselves, he's not the one going out there and scouting these guys. He is not. But
shattering my back.
It does feel like he kind of, like with Sage and some other guys, if his name is attached to the show, he goes out of his way to promote those guys a little more. So maybe it's in your best interest to try to debut there as opposed to on the Fight Pass prelims of some card, in America or overseas.
It's also a more realistic depiction of how a fighter might perform in the UFC. I mean, if you go into tough and you are living in this house and you're having to, make weight several different times over a short period of time, and you're training with people who you're going to be fighting, and all of the extra stuff that's associated with tough that is unrealistic within the realm of how a real fighter really prepares for an actual fight. What does it really mean? I mean, we've seen some winners on tough do pretty well in the UFC. We've seen some that haven't. I think the Contender Series at least allows the fighter to live within his or her own universe, the way that person would actually prepare in their own gym for a fight. So it's a little bit more, telling, I would say, as to how a fighter might actually perform in the UFC.
Last thing about which one prepares you more for the UFC. If you look at I was also talking about this with somebody. If you look at the history of success, how many UFC champions have come from the Ultimate Fighter? Like a pretty significant number. When you start to count like Michael Bisping, Rashad Evans, Forrest Griffin, that's actually a pretty long list. And it used to be the case. I remember like season 5. When it was like the BJ Penn, Jens Pulver series, man, there's still guys on the roster from that. That was when you were like, let's get the big names from the regional scene, Nate Diaz included, right? And now it's like, let's find a gimmick to fill a roster
because
slot.
There's just too many shows. So,
right.
So back then, when there were 8 to 10 shows a year, you could afford to put those guys on this show, but now you need to fill up cards, and there's more competition out there. So, look, we're going to get one more season at least after this one.
God, kill me.
Because that's what they're contracted to, and it's going to be very interesting to see if it sticks around, post 2018. All right, let's talk about last weekend here for a second, because I thought it was a really good card. It was a super long card. It lasted like 7.5 hours. The one in Glendale, because there were 14 fights on the card, which I think is the most since UFC 2, if memory serves me correct. In the main event, we had Dustin Poirier against Justin Gaethje. It's a fight that everyone had high hopes for, and I think it's a fight that met those expectations, if not exceeded them. It was a phenomenal fight. It may be the contender right now for Fight of the Year. I thought there was a lot to take away from that fight. I thought there were a lot of interesting stories to talk about. What was your biggest takeaway from that fight?
Ooh. So we were talking before the show about the Raptors and the Warriors and
Wizards.
God, Jesus, what am I doing today?
I know it's been a while.
It has been a while. I got my training wheels still on. We're talking about the Raptors and the Wizards, and there was this talk maybe a year or two ago that the Wizards had arrived, and I don't buy that at all. I think they've got a long way to go before that's true. I think Dustin Poirier arrived. I think that was his best win, not merely because of the name that he beat or the way that he had to endure this beating to go do it. But what was one of the big knocks on Dustin Poirier for a long time? It was that, yeah, he's talented, black belt in jiu-jitsu. He had that mounted triangle armbar on Max Holloway.
Yep.
That you knew he could slug it out. It wasn't merely that he lost the big ones, because I wouldn't necessarily call the Michael Johnson fight like the big one, but it was that this guy could be baited into being a lesser version of himself. He just didn't have that discipline. And he's a father now, and I'm sure he's always been a devoted husband, but he certainly that's a big part of his life. And you can see that. He talked about how the importance of his wife supporting him when he was going to motels and weigh-ins by himself and everything. But I think it was not only maturity as a man and maturity as an athlete, it's a maturity as a competitor too. He had to beat Justin Gaethje by sticking to the game plan and applying it over and over and over again under an incredible stress test that is Justin Gaethje. For me, yes, he achieved high marks, and he's one of the best lightweights in the world now. And maybe, hey, you never know who he could beat. He could maybe be the guy at some point. He's only 29 years old.
It's crazy.
But to me, this was Dustin Poirier turning a major corner in his life. He is one of the best in the world, no doubt about it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think that the discipline you talk about is certainly a big part of it. I think that part of that was that he wasn't a front runner in this fight. He wasn't a guy who just went out there and smoked somebody. I mean, those kinds of performances are impressive in their own way. But for me, when I see a guy who's really getting beaten up pretty good at different times, but then perseveres and ends up being the guy who comes out on top, that's always impressive to me. And not to say that Gaethje had the fight in the bag at any point, but certainly he was damaging Poirier in a big way, and Poirier had to fight through that, persevere, and then take charge and finish. I mean, that's the other thing. You know, Gaethje, you can hurt Gaethje. He's not the first guy that's hurt him, but when you finish him, that's an impressive thing.
Do you remember once upon a time there was a knock on Poirier that his chin was weak, that he had a glass chin? You remember that? I mean, I feel like he's completely dismissed that one. I mean, his last two fights obviously were big performances, but he's taken some big shots. I think once he got over the Michael Johnson fight, since then he's put in some really good performances. And to me, it is the fact that, like, the Michael Johnson fight isn't a big name fight, but it was a main event, and he was brutally knocked out in that
first round.
Yeah,
like 90 seconds or something.
Yeah, brutally knocked out. And you kind of felt, I remember thinking after that fight, like, man, like, has he reached his ceiling? You know, and he's had a few of those. You know, the Conor McGregor loss, there was a lot that went into that fight, and you could tell. I remember his tweets afterwards, like, he was heartbroken. And a lot of fighters don't come back from that, and he has come back from several of those. I remember interviewing him backstage in Fairfax, Virginia, when he lost to the Korean Zombie. He was devastated. He was demoralized. He thought that was the fight that was going to get him the title shot, and he could hardly speak. He was so emotional. Credit to him that he actually came and did the post-fight interview. And so, yes, fighters are always going to overcome those things, but he's overcome a few of them. And the fact that he's even in this discussion right now, and it seems like he's no longer like the level before the contenders. It feels like he's now in that contenders spot. Certainly. You know what I mean? And honestly, I can see a few things falling his way to where he fights for the belt next. Like, it is not. It is not the craziest thing to say that his next fight would be for the belt. If Conor doesn't come back, if they can't, Tony's knee doesn't heal, like, he's there. He's that guy. Yeah,
the pieces are definitely waiting for him. And all the pieces that have to fall into place, they're not such long shots, really. I mean, we don't know what the legal system is going to do to Conor McGregor. Even if it just delays his return a little bit, well, you know, Habib, as soon as Ramadan observation is over, he'll be ready to get into a training camp and fight somebody. And who's he gonna fight? Well, if McGregor's not available, and I don't think Ferguson's going to be available. I mean, who knows? But certainly that knee did not look so good when the pictures that he posted. Well, you know, then of course, this weekend has a big main event that potentially could yield a challenger for the belt, but Poirier certainly has a claim as much as anybody.
You got to be real careful in this sport of writing people off. It's been a big mistake I've made. One of the things that you do and as an analyst as you try to grow, either as someone who tries to get into the technical details or just analyzing the sport at large, sometimes we borrow a lot of how boxing treats its own competitors. And I'm not mad or suggesting that the way in which boxing does it is wrong for their sport. In fact, because they have this super developed amateur system and, you know, guys will get 20 fights before they even face any kind of real challenge for the most part. When somebody does lose, it actually might tell you a lot more, or if somebody puts together a series of losses, it can be very telling. MMA doesn't work that way, not at all. I'm not suggesting that MMA fighters are, you know, they're, of course they're insanely tough, but I have deep respect for boxing as well. Again, I want to make it about an architecture issue, not about a, you know, it's not like those guys don't have character as athletes, they do. But in MMA, when you see somebody in a losing streak, and I know we're going to talk about Carlos Condit later in the show, you've got to be very, very careful about declaring them done, or that this is their ceiling and they can't go back. Guys in this sport have shown me time and again, it's been maybe the biggest mistake I've ever made. These are incredibly perseverant athletes, and this is a sport that offers you way more redemption than just about any other combat sport out there. And a guy like Dustin Poirier, and again, the fact that he's still 29, it gives you indication that he had a moment to collect himself and then come back. Always be careful. Let's not take the way in which athletes are examined in boxing and use their talking points and treat it for MMA. It won't always work.
Yeah, I mean, use the word redemption. It almost doesn't even feel like it's redemption. In boxing, it would be redemption if somebody were to start losing. But in MMA, I mean, we could go weight class to weight class and find fighters who have lost between 5 and 10 times in their career and find, you know, just all-star caliber guys in every single one of those weight classes. And that's just the way it is in the sport. They don't create gimmies. I know we've, at different times when someone's been out, we've said we have this guy come back and get it like a kind of a tune-up fight. Well, even tune-up fights are against people who are, you know, who are at a whole different level than, say, what a boxing promoter would put their guy in with. So I think that, I mean, I know you're starting this based upon the Poirier example, but there are a lot of people like that we sometimes we see them, we think they're reaching their ceiling, and they just haven't pushed through it yet.
I believe the UFC wants Khabib Nurmagomedov to return in November at Madison Square Garden. That obviously makes a lot of sense considering how popular he is. The Russian population, we saw what it did in Brooklyn a couple weeks ago. Let's say all the options are available for early November. Let's say Conor is free. Let's say Tony is free. Let's say Nate Diaz, Eddie Alvarez, Dustin Poirier, anyone you want to mention. Who should Poirier fight? Should it be
Poirier?
Yeah, who should Poirier fight? Should it be Khabib? Like, let's say he's fighting against all of these guys. Not Conor's in, you know, in legal trouble. Everyone's available. Poirier's standing right there alongside. Should he be in that title fight, or would you go a different route with him?
If Conor's available, again, it's promotional malpractice not to book him. It just is. I'm sorry. And I know that some people are like, why do we want to see this? And I'm over Conor. You can be over Conor. I'm not. I'm not over Conor. I have missed Conor. I would like to see him come back, all his transgressions notwithstanding. He didn't lose his title by putting it on the line. I would like to see that rectified, or at least not rectified exactly, but to see that actually put to the test of what a fight like that would have been. You just have to do it. And also for all the commercial reasons that make sense. Here's the thing. You know, I was trying to, when you gave us the rundown for topics, I was trying to noodle through, like, what is the right way to handle Dustin Poirier here? What's fair to him? And the answer is, I have no clue. You know, I want to stress this again. For all the reasons that we want to see Conor back in the octagon, the UFC needs to be very careful about letting guys drop titles or putting guys in a position where you know you're going to have to strip this away from him later, like a St. Pierre kind of thing, because it is a disaster. Now we have a new champion, and some people don't consider him legitimate because he beat Ali Quinto on short notice and that all the problems they're in. And now there's a question of, you got two guys, Eddie Alvarez coming off of a great win, and now you've got Dustin Poirier on this incredible moment. These guys are super deserving, but they're sitting on the outside because now Tony was stripped, but he's injured. It is a complete disaster, and there's literally no easy answer. But if Conor's available, I just don't see how you don't pick him.
Yeah, I mean, it's not even about the bad blood between McGregor and Khabib. It's not even about all the money that can be made. I know those are factors, and I know those are things that are going to factor in, but it's really just simply about one guy just has the championship belt, and the other guy never lost it. He had the belt, and it was taken away because he went off looking for fame and fortune in boxing, and so they have to meet. I mean, that just, if they're both available, they have to meet. they do their tug of war. We'll see who comes out on top. So you've set that aside right there. Then you've got all the other guys left. You said everybody's available. So you got Ferguson. You've got the winner of this weekend's main event. You've got Poirier. You've got Eddie Alvarez. What do you put together? I mean, I would say that Poirier has enough momentum that he could get either this weekend's winner or Tony Ferguson. I mean, I think that he has earned a spot in a title fight. He just hasn't earned a spot ahead of the other guys.
Right.
If the chips don't fall his way, and if Conor's available, I agree, it has to be Conor versus Khabib. I think it's the biggest fight the UFC could put on, period. Regardless of weight class, it probably will be the most lucrative fight in the history of the sport if, promoted correctly and they can build on this momentum, because everyone knows about the feud now. Everyone's talking about it because of what happened in Brooklyn. So if that's done, if that's happening, it has to be the Eddie Alvarez rematch, in my opinion. It ended.
But isn't Eddie steadfastly against this?
Yeah, but at this point, you both just beat the same guy.
I know. You look at them on the rankings; they're right next to each other.
What's your reasoning? You're not getting a title shot because Conor is there. You could go call out other people, but at this point, Eddie Alvarez has built a reputation on fighting anyone, anytime, never turning down opponents. What is going on here? That's the thing that doesn't make that much sense. You were doing okay in that fight.
Well, it makes plenty of sense.
But if you don't run it back, I mean, you could run it back, sure. But if you don't, you have two opponents sitting out there. You've got Tony Ferguson, and you've got the winner of this weekend's main event.
Poirier's
so each one of those guys
could past the winner of this weekend's main event, in my opinion. Poirier's past the winner. I mean, Barbosa just,
Oh, significant. Both those guys are coming off of losses.
Yes,
Yeah.
And rather one-sided losses to a degree. So what I would do is Khabib, Conor, Poirier, Alvarez 2. If all goes well, he recovers. I really would love to see Ferguson, Nate Diaz. I feel like that's the fight. They tried to make it last year.
And if they could make it, I actually would like to see Poirier, Ferguson. I think that's the pairing that intrigues me the most.
And then I'll just throw out one more. Winner of this weekend, Lee Barbosa against James Vick, because I do feel like he deserves that big fight, and he's on this amazing winning streak. And so there you go. I just feel like that other fight was so good, the Alvarez fight last May, and it ended, somewhat controversially. There was an inconclusive finish. It's just it's the easiest. That is a main event, easy, on Fox, or co-main event of a pay-per-view. It has to happen. How does it not happen? Now, Eddie Alvarez has one fight left on his contract. Maybe he doesn't want to take a fight like that on the last fight of his deal. Maybe they can't come to terms. Business might come into play here. But to me, if we're playing with a full deck of cards, it is a no-brainer. It has to be the rematch.
I'll tell you why he's not doing it. Number one, don't believe fighter rhetoric. It is not that Eddie Alvarez is somehow scared. I don't think that. Look at his record of achievement. I've listed it once. All the champions he's beaten.
Yeah.
WC, UFC. Of course, he was a UFC champion. Strike Force, One, Dream, the whole nine. He's got in the Bellator an insane collection of scalps, and now World Series of Fighting as well. So his record of achievement speaks for itself. But he has got 4 kids. He is a little bit longer in the tooth. Been working on something. I can't quite debut it right now, but I'm working on some math about with somebody about how much difference it makes being champion. And I'm not going to get into the details of it, except to say it is way more. It is your life as a fighter in the UFC when you have a belt or you're in a championship bout versus not. It's a different universe. It's almost like being in World Series of Fighting versus being in the UFC in terms of what it means for your exposure in your life. And I think what those guys are doing is, I'm not saying he's at the end of his career, no, but he clearly is much closer to the end than the beginning. I think he realizes if I'm going to make some money, I got to make some money now. And Poirier, by the way, who's not a champion, who's tough as nails, doesn't offer you a whole lot in that way. I mean, yes, I agree. You just look at it from our vantage point, it's like, oh my God, this is the perfect pairing. But I can understand why he is highly resistant to it.
Okay, let me ask you this. If Conor's on the sidelines, Ferguson's injured, you're not playing ball with Nate Diaz, you're essentially left with Alvarez and Poirier next for Khabib. Who deserves it more?
Poirier, in my judgment.
Interesting.
It's because Eddie's coming off the 1 win, right? So, which was
the same guy.
The same guy. Yeah. And Poirier is coming off of the 2 wins.
Yeah.
By the way, 2 champions, because he beat former champions.
Yeah.
In Pettis and, of course, now in Gaethje. And again, look, Eddie's performance was incredible against Gaethje. It was just as good, if not better, in many ways. But I just feel like there's a certain hunger with Poirier. Eddie already had a shot at a title, already held the title. Poirier's never been in that position. it's a great fight too, by the way, because Poirier can thump. So I like that fight.
Your pick?
Yeah, I would agree with Poirier for a lot of the reasons you gave. But I will say that Eddie they did just both beat Gaethje, and Eddie did it first. He sort of handed the guy his first loss. So in some way, that's a even more significant victory because you took down somebody who had never been defeated,
right.
And I think that's quite an accomplishment. But I think by a nose, or maybe it's just by having done it more recently, for whatever it is, it just feels to me like Dustin Poirier is the guy who I would pick.
Let's talk about the flip side of Saturday night's main event, and it's Justin Gaethje picking up his second loss now, second in a row, going into that Eddie Alvarez fight in December. He was undefeated. And we've been talking about Justin Gaethje for a long time, even back in the WSOF days. And I feel like the narrative has always been he's incredible, he's exciting, but what happens when he fights top 5 guys in the UFC? Is his style going to change? Does he have to change his style? Is he just going to go in there and get knocked up like he is against the Rich Petishnoks and the Luis Palominos of the world? Or is he going to recognize that you can't fight that way against the top 5s? Well, I think we've learned that he is going to continue to fight that way. Have we, unless he changes his stripes, is this as far as Justin Gaethje is going to go? And it's fascinating when you listen to him afterwards, like he doesn't seem all that upset. Like he's happy to put on a show, and he says essentially, live by the sword, die by the sword. I got 5 fights left. I'm going to go out like this. This is how I arrived. I'm going to go out like this. Does that, in your opinion, does that kind of almost feel like a shame? Because this guy is talented, but yet he continues to be involved in these firefights. He's not even 30 years old as well. He's taking a lot of damage.
Yeah, well, it's almost like he's a higher level of the way Leonard Garcia used to fight. I mean, he just went in there and yeah, of course.
Yeah,
but I sort of get that same vibe from him that he's just going to go in there and he's going to bang with somebody. And when he first came over here and he fought Michael Johnson, I remember about 2 minutes into that fight, I thought, well, he has suddenly come into the UFC and he has reached his level, and that's, I guess we've learned where his ceiling is. And then 5 minutes later I was like eating those words.
Yeah.
And so we know that if he can finish a guy off, he could beat some of these top level guys. I mean, he did some damage to both of the last 2 guys that he lost to. So it's not like he went in there and had his doors blown off by either Eddie Alvarez or Dustin Poirier. I mean, he is competitive with those guys, but ultimately he lost the fight. So yeah, maybe you could say that he's reached his ceiling, but who knows? The next time he goes out, he might fight somebody at that level and finish the job in that first round. He is capable of beating most anybody in that division. And
is he doing a disservice to himself by not fighting a little more cautiously, a little more defensively? Or is that just, we love this Justin Gaethje. The fans clearly love the guy.
Yeah, he's got the most fan-friendly style of any UFC fighter ever.
So does it not matter?
It does matter. It matters significantly. I have these debates with people all the time. I'm not going to super get into it, but this idea of like, well, we have to really stamp down doping in sport because of the harm it might cause others. I'm like, well, you watching what this guy's doing to himself? Because even if it's doing it to himself, there are still plenty of ethical concerns about whether that's appropriate, to be quite honest. But that's not really what I want to focus in on. This is one of the situations where having at least, I think, some understanding of the X's and O's about how he fights matters. Now, I would ask anybody to go talk to a coach or MMA fighter to get a real breakdown. But one thing I noticed when I went back and watched his Alvarez fight and I watched his Poirier fight is he doesn't take anything away from his opponents. Here's what I mean. They come in with game plans, and they might change some things up in the first round to the second round or within the first round itself, but they find something they want to target, and they go back to it and back to it and back to it over and over again. Max Holloway, by round 2, will take that away from you. By round 3, you won't even be close to landing that. He takes all your weapons away from you. Justin doesn't. Now, he's, of course, landing his own offense there, but here's what I mean. He never tailors his offense for an opponent. And you notice he got beat right near the 15-minute mark against Eddie Alvarez and right after the 15-minute mark against Dustin Poirier. In other words, it takes him about 15 minutes of suffering, but then that game plan they had, which was working the entire time, it was landing. That left hook on the counter to the kick for Poirier was landing the entire time. All he needed was to land just the right way, and boom, he wins. So this tells me that this is a very talented, very tough guy. but he's not willing to compete in a way that every other guy at that level does. Most of the guys who fight like Justin Gaethje, they'll have success at the regional level. There's a gazillion Justin Gaethjes at the regional level. It's just when they graduate up, somebody smokes them. But you can't smoke Justin. He's a totally anomalous in that way. All I'm saying is, unless he doesn't fight anything like what he's been fighting the last 20 fights, he is going to keep doing the exact same things because that's the only method he really understands. That is scary. That is scary. A guy who doesn't tailor his offense at all, who, according to Fight Metric, absorbs more strikes than he dishes out per minute. That is very troubling. And so for me, it's like, can he beat another top 5 guy? He might. Because you got to be Eddie Alvarez tough. You got to be Dustin Poirier tough to beat that dude. But there's a lot of tough dudes out there. And if you're going to be just the kind of guy who goes just like this every time, all it takes is about 15 minutes and they have your number.
Yeah, and Poirier actually posted a video of him practicing that counter in the locker room.
He landed it from the beginning of the first round all the way through.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, it is kind of an all offense, no defense, like Air Coryell kind of fighting style in a sense. But that's where it has got him where he's has reached right now. And it is the thing that in the right moment, if he lands the right shot against Poirier, he wins that fight. If he lands the right shot against Eddie Alvarez, too. But a guy who might be a little bit a lesser fighter who just fights strategically might also be able to beat him. So that's where that is kind of the rub. I mean, he's probably capable of beating guys who are better than him, but he might be capable of losing to guys who are not as good as him just because of of that lack of strategy.
And I don't get the feeling that he's any less popular, as you said. His style.
People love him as they should. He's totally he's so unique, you know.
Yeah.
Take for example the announcement that Mike Perry is fighting Yancy Medeiros. This news comes out this week, and everyone's going gaga. Oh, this is such a great fight. No one mentioning that they both lost their last fights. You know, Medeiros lost in the first round. Perry was somewhat outclassed.
Yeah, I actually don't like that fight.
I don't like it either.
Yeah.
We'll talk about it during after the beat.
Okay.
But it's just amazing how in MMA, to your point earlier, the losses don't mean as much as in boxing. So I fully suspect that when Gaethje is booked against someone else, hopefully he takes a bit of time off here, people are going to say, this is a great fight because him against anyone is typically a great fight. Let's now talk about someone else who has a similar fan-friendly style, and I think the fans hold him in the same kind of regard. Carlos Condit. Carlos Condit posted after his loss to Alex Oliveira on Saturday something that was very honest and very Carlos Condit-like, to the point, and it was a little sad to read, but it's also like, man, this is the best of MMA. This guy represents why we love this sport so much
100%.
because he's posting a picture of himself after a submission loss, and he's very honest about the highs and lows. Yes, exactly, that's the word. Do you think this is the end? Like after you read that, do you feel like Condit was telling us, I don't want to say it's the end, but this sort of feels like the end?
Here's the big question, and we always wrestle with it. When you're that guy, how do you know it's the end? How do you know? And the answer is you probably don't until it gets tragic. It's only when you get super, super bad are you like, oh, okay, this is the end. In other words, it's a fact-finding mission where the discovery process is kind of difficult. You don't really know. My hunch to answer the question is probably. Because what I was worried about after all those long wars, especially that Robbie Lawler fight where, again, I firmly believe those guys left a piece of themselves in the octagon that night. Then the Demian Maia fight, okay, so he had lost to like what? His losses were St. Pierre, greatest welterweight ever. Then Hendricks, at the time was a champ. He had lost to Tyron Woodley, champ. He had lost to Robbie Lawler, champ. Then he lost to Maia, #1 contender. You're like, okay, it's not, let's see. Then he loses to Magny, and you're like, okay, top 10. Cowboy Oliveira wasn't even top 10. And my thought was, in watching him, he's not shot by any stretch of the imagination, but there's a question about how competitive he is at the top of that division. And then you could say, well, what do you as a fighter, what do you want? Do you want to be competitive, or do you want to be a champion? And that, I think if he wanted to stay in the UFC and get wins, he probably could. But for a guy who had such a spectacular career, for a lack of a better description, my hunch is that, again, very careful not to close the door on somebody like the natural born killer. But the evidence for now suggests he's not competitive with the top of that division. And I actually did not get sad reading that Instagram message. I actually was heartened by that because it didn't get tragic. It didn't get sad. It didn't get pathetic. He has keen self-awareness. He is protecting himself. He's excited about his family and his business. I was heartened by it.
It could get said, I guess, if he sticks around.
Potentially.
But he definitely is aware of where he's at.
I mean, I guess that I didn't put as much stock into that because it was happening, because the message came so soon after the fight. And we've seen in the past fighters become very self-reflective in the immediate aftermath of a loss often. And then, a couple months later, they're just gung-ho to get back in there again. And so I hope that he has, he takes a look at that video a little bit, down the road and recognizes what he was experiencing at that moment, because I guarantee you, in a few weeks, he's going to be thinking a whole different way. And we've, we always say, well, it wouldn't be great if he had advisors, trainers, coaches, teammates, people who might guide him in the right direction. But, in this sport, we've not really seen too many examples of fighters being guided correctly. Oftentimes people just will enable them to continue on if they want to continue on. And who's to stop them? They want to earn money. They want to, they want to win. They think that they once were at a certain height. They think they can get back there. And unfortunately, this sport is not populated by too many people who will tell you the truth.
Historically, fighters who say, I'm going to take a break, or I was considering retirement, whenever they come back, if they come back, they never really quite fight like themselves. And that's the Carlos Condit, I think, that we saw against Neil Magny. It never felt like he got out of neutral in that fight. Mm-hmm. And Carlos Condit, is a better, like, when it's all said and done, both careers, Carlos Condit is a better fighter than Neil Magny. That's just the way it is. But he just wasn't there that night. And all credit to Magny. Magny fought great and got the victory. I said after the first round on Saturday, it kind of feels like the old Carlos is back.
He was
a lot
competing.
More, yeah, he was a lot more aggressive. He was competing, like he was getting out of neutral. And then, of course, second round. And by the way, like we focused on Condit in the aftermath, but Oliveira deserves a ton of credit. Took that fight on 2 weeks' notice, and had to lose a lot of weight. So that was the fight before the fight. I do feel like now it's time for him maybe to take that time off, and I agree. I feel like he kind of left a piece of himself. He's never quite the same guy after the Lawler fight. Lawler's not the same guy after that fight as well.
How could you be?
The sad part is, for me, is that I think he won that fight. And he got the interim belt.
I agree.
And the interim belt was never truly, it's an interim belt.
And he got on the Diaz fight where he was widely mocked for movement.
To this day, which is a crazy thing that Condit, of all people, would be mocked. But he never got that title in the UFC, and I feel like he earned it that night against Lawler. So that, to me, is the bummer in all of this, because he truly is one of the greats at 170. Former WEC champ. He was a pillar of that organization for many, many years. Do we have a favorite Condit moment? Is there one moment?
Yeah, for sure. Let me give a bit of recommendation, because folks have always asked me, what's a fight you love that may be off the radar? It was actually his last WEC fight against Hiromitsu Mura.
Oh, yeah.
If you have not seen that fight, no one pushed Condit in the WEC ever. Like Carlo Prater, no. I mean, you can just go through the list. None of those guys did. He was clearly better than all of them. And he was better than Mura, too. But Hiromitsu Mura was hitting, standing foot sweeps and pushed Condit for the first time into a championship rounds. Highly, highly recommend you go watch that fight. I would have two favorite moments that I really like from Carlos Condit. Number one, the third round against Rory McDonald at UFC 115. Where he was, Rory McDonald, if you've not seen this contest, was putting it on him bad. And he somehow got a reversal, got on top, and just let Rory McDonald have it. 7 seconds until the bell rang. And if it had gone to the bell, best case scenario, it's 10-8. Probably with judges these days, or those days anyway, 10-9, he probably would have lost it. So he had to really get that one. And just, that was one of those moments where who wants it more? Carlos wanted it more, at least that night. Then the other one, the last one I would say is, I was looking at all the odds for all of Carlos's old fights. I didn't realize he was a significant underdog against Dan Hardy. And Dan Hardy has turned out to be a sensational analyst for the UFC. But Dan Hardy went to that fight off the St. Pierre fight, ton of confidence. I fixed everything, yada, yada. Carlos Condit, who's this guy? And Carlos went in there and on a gunfight, and he won. And that's why people love him, because he's that guy.
Yep.
Yeah, the one that's most memorable for me is the Dan Hardy one, because of the simultaneous left hooks that both guys started throwing the punch almost at the exact same moment, but Carlos was just that much quicker, and Hardy just went down like a sack of potatoes. It was one of the more exhilarating knockouts that I can remember in the UFC, just because of that, because you saw two guys throwing, and whoever landed was going to get a knockout. You could just, because they both threw from their heels, and Carlos is the guy that connected. That was a great one.
That's a good way to put
it. I
it.
I love that one, and I also love the Nick Diaz fight. I mean, I know that he took a lot of criticism, but he fought a really smart fight, and he beat Nick Diaz. There was no, you could I know that a lot of our Nick Diaz fans will sort of bemoan that, but he won that fight because he was a smarter fighter that night, and he beat him.
I also wanted to highlight the Hardy fight. I was in attendance at the O2 Arena.
Oh, wow.
And that place.
Yeah, it was on Hardy's home turf.
Yeah. It was in London. It was a numbered show. It was UFC 120, but it was on Spike, so it aired via tape delay in the U.S. But I was in attendance, and that was supposed to be the return of Hardy, big showcase fight for him, co-main event to Michael Bisping, and that place got so quiet.
Do you remember what Condit told the media before that fight? What his particular wording was?
Oh man, it's like on the tip of my tongue, but
That he had Hardy's number.
yeah. He was super confident.
Pretty funny.
Yeah. He actually stopped by the MMA Hour on his way to London, so he was in studio that week, and he was supremely confident. That was a weird night for the English fans, because John Hathaway was also on that card, and it was supposed to be like a big showcase fight for him against Mike Pyle, and Pyle came in and completely derailed that. I remember Hathaway was undefeated, I think like 14-0 at the time, and then Condit knocks out Hardy. Bisping beat Akiyama, but it was a close fight. So yeah, that place went super quiet after that knockout. Also, the prime time leading up to Diaz Condit, the final scene of them. I watch it all the time, and I just watched it again.
On the mountaintop?
No, it kind of starts there, but it's they're going back and forth, and Diaz is getting very agitated with the interviewer, and he's like, who wrote these questions? Who told you to ask these questions? And then there's a scene where Condit's on his bed, and he says, I'm done, and he gets up and he walks away, and it just that fight was just because there's such real fighters and with passionate fan bases. I love that final. It's UFC 143 prime time. The last segment, you can find it on YouTube. It's just phenomenal. It encompasses Condit and Diaz perfectly. Like their personalities, no nonsense.
The one thing that should be noted also about Carlos Condit is he had to earn everyone's respect twice.
Yep.
So he was the champion WEC, and there were a lot of people who were like, man, they're going to fold that division. Who is he? He's nobody. And he lost to Martin Kampmann, although in a sensational fight in his debut. He had to earn his respect in the UFC, and so by the time they fought Kampmann again, he was, he had clearly improved beyond measure. But I just want to make a note. It wasn't like he just sauntered into the UFC and everyone gave him a round of applause. No, he had to prove who he was, and he did.
One more thing about the Glendale card. We had a lot of praise for Israel Adesanya after his debut in Perth. He picked up a win against Marvin Vettori, but I did see a lot of, and he's been very, I think, honest about his assessment, wasn't happy with it. I know you spoke to him. Mm-hmm. Do we need to slow down the hype train on Israel Adesanya, or was this just a solid victory over a very big and strong and talented? I think Marvin Vettori doesn't get enough credit. He's a solid fighter, and that was a tough second fight for him. Do we slow it down, or is Adesanya still who we thought he was?
I guess it depends on how fast you want to drive it.
Yeah.
I know some folks were like, title fight, can't be that far away, and I was always like, no, like, not that he's not a guy you wouldn't eye as somebody who could take a title down the road, but he needs time to work on it quite clearly, and point out like Vettori is one of these guys who's going to look hard. It's going to be hard to look good against because he's a monster of a middleweight, and he actually has some ability. He's not as refined or as polished or as technically pretty as Adesanya, but he's rough and rugged and in the trenches. And so that was a tough fight for Adesanya, at least in that third round by the time he got around to it. So for me, it's like full steam ahead, but I'm very much an incrementalist by heart anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the train should always move slowly. The hype train, it just gets ahead of itself. We are so impatient for this guy that we see do something excellent early in the career. It's like, okay, let's just push him forward. And what is the what is the damage done if we just make it a little bit slower train? Let it move along. He will improve. This was a good step forward. It was not a step backward at all. He didn't get upset. He just had a tougher fight, and again, that's just like we were talking about earlier on with the Poirier win. Sometimes the tougher fight is more impressive than the fight where you go out there and smoke somebody. And I think that it's just one more part of his growth.
Let's move along and talk about the Professional Fighters League, because last year around this time they came out and said that they were going to rebrand from WSOF to PFL, and that they were hoping for their relaunch to be in January of 2018. That obviously didn't happen, but they officially announced on Monday that they will be starting their rebrand, if you will. Their relaunch will actually take place beginning June 7th at the theater at Madison Square Garden. It is worth noting they keep saying Madison Square Garden, but it's not Madison Square Garden. It's the theater, which is not bad, but it's
still big.
Yes, it's on MSG, but fair enough. I'm a stickler for those things. And they've laid out, the venues and the season and the rules and the roster. It's all there. And it's a lot to break down here off the top of my head, but you can easily find it. And I remember us talking about it when it first came out because there weren't as many details revealed. And we all kind of said, like, okay, let's wait and see until they actually roll out all the details of the roster and all that stuff. So now that it's out, how do you guys feel about the PFL? Do you have high hopes? Because they're still dangling that $1 million carrot. They're promising some pretty big paydays if you can make it to the end. They've broken things down with, their point system and all that. How do we feel about it? Do you feel like this can actually be a major player in the sport?
Well, they're going to be on Thursdays, right?
Thursdays, yeah.
You know what I love about that is the one time, who knows what the playoffs will be for that regular season, the one time they're in my hometown of D.C., we'll all be in Las Vegas.
Oh, is it the week of?
It's the week of, it's the fight week for International Fight Week, so that's, yay, fun. Yeah. Neither here nor there. I just wanted to bring that up because I was personally annoyed by that.
By the way, all their shows are on the East Coast. Except for maybe towards the end. I think there's a Las Vegas to do, but it's 2 in Atlantic City, 2 on Long Island, New York, Washington, Chicago, which I think is interesting because typically upstarts don't travel the East Coast. Maybe that has something to do with their investors.
I think so, yeah. So in any case, here's what I would say. Look, I don't believe the tournament model works, and I don't believe it's a good idea. I think you could end up with a situation where you're cutting $1 million check to fighters who have virtually no fan awareness or appeal, who could just be guys who are good tournament fighters. And you can't build anybody like that, and you're going to pay out something that would make no sense ultimately. I think that the matchmaking model has plenty of drawbacks, but it is clearly the superior one. However, I think in defense of them, what I will say is, like the Bellator era of Bjorn Rebney, if you get some guys who have some standout performances in the tournaments, especially if it's like a guy who, like a Rick Story, let's say, it could be a redemptive moment, or even a Will Brooks, right? Let's say Will Brooks goes through and just plows through the tournament. It's possible that these guys can not only earn themselves a lot of money, but maybe resurrect their names inside the MMA community. And I think it's probably a best case scenario for the PFL and whoever fighter that ends up being.
So not exactly high hopes.
I think that sounds. I think what Luke just laid out is kind of a good scenario. I mean, I don't see that as a losing scenario. It's when you say high hopes, I mean, this is not a company that's going to go in and make Dana White have a sleepless night. And this is not really this is not a competitor for the UFC by any means. And I don't know that even Scott Coker is going to be having sleepless nights either. I mean, these guys are, if they're, I know that they've got the big money check at the end of the rainbow, but ultimately they're bringing in fighters who are at a certain level, who some of whom are names we recognize, and like you said, they're fighting at the theater at Madison Square Garden. They're not fighting at Madison Square Garden. I think that in itself is kind of a way to frame what this is about. This is about being the proximity of the mainstream of MMA, but not really quite in there. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't think that's necessarily, I mean, that may sound like a negative comment, but I think that there's space within this MMA world for different players, and I think they'll find their spot.
It depends what they want, the organization. Like, what do they want for themselves? And
to make money?
Sure, but every organization wants to make money. Sure. But I think you got a lot of people on staff there who were bigwigs in various parts of sports media companies, or have had a long career inside combat sports. You've got some talented people running the organization. That should be noted. I still think it's a fatal flaw, quite candidly, that they picked this model. But be that as it may, they're not dummies over there. They're actually pretty smart people. But the major mistake I'll give Bjorn Rebney credit for one thing, man, and I mean this. If you go back, he did an interview. Remember Sergio Non?
Yes, of course.
He actually now works he still works in Capitol Hill, but he works on like tech policy. Okay. But he was a great reporter for USA Today back in the day. Folks may not remember him, but he did great work, and he did an interview with Bjorn Rebney. And Bjorn Rebney noted in that interview, this was like, I think Bellator was on like MTV2 at the time, or maybe was about to be or something. And he was talking about how he built Bellator around the idea of sustainability, about making sure that they had as few costs as possible. Yes, you have to pay people appropriately to recruit the right kind of talent. But if you look at some of these regional promoters like King of the Cage, they've got a good thing going. They can keep doing it, but it limits their scope. One of the big errors that maybe Bjorn Rebney made was trying to compete with the UFC and grow. It's when you actually try to grow that becomes the problem. But if you want to be something small, you can be pretty sustainable actually in the space. So the question is, what does PFL want to be? Do they want to be small and sustainable, or do they want to be big and noteworthy? And when you begin to get big and noteworthy, you get bigger media attention, but you have much bigger costs, and that could be a problem.
Okay, so that is a very good point. The problem is, it feels, at least for now, like they're trying to be both. Big and noteworthy with their purses. I mean, those are gigantic purses. And there's no way that, the revenue at the gate and whatever other revenue, certainly not their TV revenue because it's not a very lucrative deal, is going to offset that. So how are you going to, play with the big dogs in terms of your purses, but also run smaller shows, theater, and other small, you know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
That, to me, feels like a very, very, very slippery slope. That's a dangerous game that you're playing. You're promising $1 million just to win the tournament, let alone all the money that you're paying out to get to that point. I don't, as of right now, see many diamonds in the rough as far as the roster is concerned. I'll be happy to be proven wrong. I think if you're a fight fan, and of course someone who competes in MMA, how could you be against another player coming on the scene, right? How could you be against...
Oh, sure, it's great for fans.
But it's great for the sport. It's great for the health status of the sport. It's always better to have more competition. It's always better to have other options. Remember 10 years ago, when there was Elite XC and there was Affliction and there was IFL and there was Strikeforce and there was UFC and Pride just died, there were a lot more options than there are today. And so it's good to have one. It's good to have Bellator. It's good to have PFL. It's good to have UFC, of course. So I think everyone wants them to succeed. I'm just worried about those numbers that they're promising at the end of the rainbow, because I feel like those might expedite the death a little quicker unless something changes drastically. I just don't know who's selling tickets to get to sort of justify these costs. Who are the draws? How are you going to actually do it? Because the name doesn't mean anything right now. You're not getting a ton from the TV deal.
Right.
I'm worried about that number that they're promising at the end. That's the problem. If they weren't promising that number and they're saying, look, we're going to take a slow approach to this, we're going to build things up, there's going to be a nice little chunk at the end, but $1 million is a lot. How many guys in Bellator are making $1 million at the end of the rainbow?
The $1 million becomes almost like the star of the show in a sense, as opposed to the actual athletes.
The $1 million was the star of the show for the XFL too. It was called the $1 million game, the last game. And
Oh, I forgot about that. Yeah.
You can't. That's a problem in its own right, right?
In theory, it is. Although, again, it might be something that makes some people want to watch. It's like, oh, these guys are fighting for $1 million. This is something that I might.
People are watching because every other athlete under the sun who you watch on TV is making way more than $1 million. So that doesn't.
Not
mean
in this
anything.
sport. Not in the fighters.
People don't know that. Casual fans don't realize that. I just think it's a fundamental problem to be. I'm thrilled that
it's not sustainable, but it may be the startup cost of just getting yourself out there, get your name established. So you do something, you make a big splash, and then you sort of rein things in.
I will say this: I think Thursday is a good day, as much as it screws up your week in DC. I do feel like it's a good day. Don't go on Friday because then you're eventually going up against Bellator. Don't go on Saturday, of course. Sunday, people aren't like that's not an MMA day. It's usually after UFC. People are tired. It feels like Thursday is a good day. You could be sort of at the head of the curve in terms of the week, the weekend. So I like the day.
Actually,
that
I think they're on the 3rd, which would make it a Tuesday, right?
They may have changed.
So July 7th for UFC.
Yeah.
So that would be the day. I have to look. It could be July 3rd, July 5th. I don't know.
Yeah, I'd be surprised if it's July 3rd. I mean, every other date is a Thursday.
I'm okay with Tuesday MMA.
Yeah, but I don't think, all the other days are Thursday, because I know June 7th is a Thursday, and then it's every second Thursday. Yeah, right. So they take a week off and then they go. So that's the PFL story. We'll wait and see. We'll obviously wish them the best and keep an open mind. One last topic before we go here, because we are running out of time. I do feel like we have to address, because you talked about, Scott Coker's nightmares and things like that. It feels like he's living one right now. I mean, the ratings for the last show, if this isn't rock bottom, I'm afraid to ask what is rock bottom. But I want to just pull them up because I don't want to get them wrong here. So the last show was headlined by, and of course, I just lost it, but the last show was headlined by Michael Chandler versus Brandon Gertz. Gertz it averaged 242,000 viewers on Paramount, and on CMT it averaged 161. And so you remember a couple of weeks ago when I told you about, and this is courtesy of our friend Jedi Goodman, who does a great job of breaking this down, about the number of events that drew under 500,000 viewers. We're now at 6 events in 2018. 5 out of the 6 have done under 500. Last year was 7 out of 22. And prior to that, they never had more than 2 that drew under 500,000. And now they hit 242 on Paramount. What is going on? Is this shocking?
It is. People are like, are you alarmed? Usually I'm like, I don't know. No, I'm alarmed.
This is alarming.
Straight up alarmed.
Yeah.
I think it's very, very worrisome. And there's a couple of factors. I was looking up the ratings for Paramount. Even their bigger stuff is not what you would imagine. Some stuff does well, but even like some of the lip sync battle can do, which is one of their bigger shows, will do like the 750K range. So this is not the days of Spike TV where they were just pulling in huge numbers.
But how could that be? It's the same channel.
But it is and it isn't actually.
But it's the same number on everyone's guide,
it's
right?
It's not the same channel. That's one of the big fundamental flaws, I think. They have changed their programming and the way in which they pitch themselves. It was different when it was UFC, 1,000 Ways to Die, Cops, Gangland.
Who would have thought that was the actual?
Well, because you were pitching one audience and you had a lot of them with men. They've got a lot of women they're attracting to their audience now, which I'm not saying is the women are to blame. I'm just saying it's not. I don't know how good of a fit Bellator is with that, but also, man, you just have to ask yourself, as MMA goes from this to this, which is what has happened, is there room for a robust number 2? There will always be room for other minnows out there, your ones and your LFAs and everything else. But is there room for a robust number 2? I am beginning to get concerned there is not.
Wow.
They need to go with the $1 million purse. That's
that's it. That's 100%.
You know what? Tournament.
Bring back the tournament. Somewhere Bjorn Rebney is very happy. He's probably in Mexico right now.
Look, where were they? Position.
Yeah. Where were they making their big splash? They're making with all the freak show fights. That was where they were kind of
Are you advocating for the return of the freak shows?
I'm not saying that's what I want to see. I'm just saying that's where they were. That's where they were making the difference. You know, the UFC doing its thing as the whatever you want to call it, the mainstream of MMA, right? And then you've got something off to the side. It's Bellator. Well, how they distinguish themselves? Well, they were distinguished themselves by having these, older fighters come together who were legendary names, or just different kinds of freak show things. And we kept complaining on this show about, well, how come they would have, a Tito fight as the main event and have a Michael Chandler below that? Well, Michael Chandler's we're starting to learn that maybe those, the kind of the old timers game fights are a bigger sell than the guys who are, in the prime and at the top of the food chain in your promotion. And that is concerning, of course. I mean, because what does that leave Scott Coker? It leaves him with a choice between going back to something that I'm not really a big fan of, but maybe that's what will end up being their lifeblood if they have to mix some of that stuff back in.
Yeah, I think that I still maintain too many events. 22 is a lot.
They increased from last year.
Yeah.
I can't believe they did that.
And I also feel like what's most concerning about this is that look at that card on Friday. And I know they lost the original main event, which was supposed to be, Chandler versus Primus. But a lot of the guys who they've spent some pretty good amount of time building up, AJ McKee, Baby Slice, Logan Storley to a lesser degree, but those were some of their blue chip prospects who were on that main card, and yet it did that. You know what I mean? And I feel like the UFC's oversaturation has had a trickle down effect to all the other promotions.
100%.
And so now there used to be a time where WEC, I remember on Versus, it had sort of a baseline of 250,000. I always used to say that 250,000 was the UFC's rock bottom for pay-per-view. We've obviously gone way past that point. But for Bellator now to go from what they were doing not that long ago to this, maybe this is an anomaly. I feel like there's a lot of pressure now on them and a lot of anxiety and stress heading into Fedor versus Mir next week. Because could you imagine if that card does anywhere near the vicinity of this? That's a big problem.
I think it'll clear 500,000, but I don't know how far it's going to do above that.
Yeah, that is scary.
Paramount is a bad fit for Bellator, but the question is not, is Paramount a good fit? The question is, if Paramount isn't, what is?
Where did they go?
And I don't know what the answer to that is.
Yeah, fascinating. Kind of scary.
It's super scary.
Yeah.
It's legitimately frightening.
Yeah. All right. That does it for this portion of the show. It has been a fun show. Good job, guys. Luke?
Took me a while.
Yeah, no, it's okay.
I had ring rust.
Ring rust.
I had ring rust.
Octagon jitters. Now, if you are watching us on Twitter, stay right there. If you're watching us on MMAfighting.com, YouTube, Facebook, all the other platforms, go to live.twitter.com/MMAfighting. You know the address, same place as always. We'll do After the Beat. We'll answer your questions. A lot of great ones this week, so I'm looking forward to getting into them. So again, live.twitter.com/MMA Fighting. After the Beat starts right now. Don't go anywhere.